It's only been one weekend of fantasy football. We have injuries. We've already learned some things, and there's a few players out there on the waiver wire that we need to pay attention to. What is going on, Headliner Nation? Hopefully everyone is doing well out there today. We're diving into the waiver wire for week 2. Now, honestly, it's not jammed packed with a bunch of huge names, but there are some players we need to pay attention to. We had some key injuries this weekend and also learned a few things as well. But it doesn't matter if you dominated in week 1 or your team struggled a little bit. Always pay attention to the waiver wire, always be active, always be watching some of these players and make sure that you can beat your league mates to them. Now, as we're going through this video, if you have any questions, be sure to leave them down below in the comment section. I'll try to respond to as many as I can. So if you're ready to dive into today's show, do me a favor, hit the like button if you haven't already, and consider subscribing. If you're not, why are you not subscribed yet? You want to dominate fantasy football? Click the subscribe button now. But all right, let's go ahead and let's talk about some of the top injuries first. And we take a look at some of these injuries. There's some big names on this list that a lot of people really need to pay close attention to. Now, we know Jordan Love suffered that left knee injury. He's going to be out for a few weeks. Not ideal, but we'll talk about that in a second. We also lost a couple tight ends, Jake Ferguson and David Njoku. For Jake Ferguson, it does sound like he escaped a major injury. They say he did not tear his ACL, it looks like, but doing more tests here today, hoping for good news there because I've absolutely loved Jake Ferguson here this offseason. David Njoku with a right ankle injury. How about Keenan Allen? He's working through a right foot injury. Now, we saw him come up hobbled a little bit after a red zone target. Is that something that bothers him into the coming weeks? What about Kenneth Walker? Had himself a great week 1, kind of dealing with an abdomen issue right now. Puka Nacua left the game early Sunday night with a right knee injury as well. And then another name we're paying very close attention to is Devon Achane. He took a big shot in week 1, was limping off the field. It's just something to pay attention to. We know this guy has struggled staying healthy in the past. So if he's already banged up in week 1 due to that excess volume, these can start to progress more and more each and every week, so it's definitely something to pay attention to. But there's also a few things we need to take away from week 1 as well. The first one, and this is me going back to the Jordan Love injury. Obviously, in fantasy football, there's a ton of fantasy viable quarterbacks, so we're going to be able to find somebody here in the interim to replace on your fantasy football team. However, this is definitely going to hurt the likes of Jaden Reed, Christian Watson, Romeo Doubs, and Dontavian Wicks. Because I'm sorry, when you lose a quarterback the caliber of Jordan Love and replace him with Malik Willis, your passing game just isn't going to be great. Now, I know this offense manufactures touches for Jaden Reed, so he may have the safest floor of everyone still, but the ceiling is going to be a lot lower. I do not expect a whole lot of wide receiver 1 overall weeks for Jaden Reed when Jordan Love is injured, but we can say this as well. This could be a boost to Josh Jacobs. They're not going to be able to throw the ball with Malik Willis like they do with Jordan Love, so they're going to have to rely even more so on the running game. A running game that is really banged up outside of Josh Jacobs. So I guess if we're looking for any type of silver lining, it could be that Josh Jacobs gets a boost here the next few weeks. We also learned, start your tight ends against the Carolina Panthers. The Carolina Panthers allowed 26 fantasy points to the New Orleans tight ends in week 1, including 2 touchdowns. And it's not like they're out there giving up huge volume to big-time tight ends. We got Foster Moreau, Taysom Hill, and Juwan Johnson. So that's something to definitely pay attention to. Maybe we're looking for streaming options at some point this season. If they're playing Carolina, it's probably a pretty good matchup. How about how bad that Cincinnati defense, how about how bad Cincinnati looked overall as a team with T. Higgins hurt? Jamar Chase is pissed. He's not happy. He's not putting in 110%. That's obvious. Joe Burrow kind of looks off because of all of that. There is nothing going right now in Cincinnati. And here's what my biggest concern is. I don't see it just flipping like a light switch and absolutely changing from one week to the next. This could definitely be something that lingers on here for the next few weeks in Cincinnati. Hopefully they can pay Jamar Chase, get things back on track, really revitalize that locker room because they did not look that great in week 1. How about Philadelphia? Now, a lot of people didn't know what to expect with this defense coming into the year. We know they can stop the run, but were they going to be able to stop the pass? Because they could not do that last year. They cannot do it again this year. They are still vulnerable to those big chunk plays deep down the field, and we know this Cincinnati offense can put points on the board, so opposing teams more than likely going to be trailing, having to throw a lot, which means a lot of garbage points in fantasy football, which we absolutely love. What about the Colts? They cannot stop the run. They allowed 213 yards rushing to Houston in week 1. Joe Mixon touched the ball 33 times against them. Now, even though Houston's offensive line is improved, I wouldn't consider them elite by any means. And if there's a big knock on Joe Mixon over the span of his career, it's that he's not overly efficient. Dude had a huge game against the Colts. If you have a running back coming up in a matchup against Indianapolis, they're probably going to be in my lineup. And then lastly, just in case anyone had forgotten, we like to mention this every few months, Daniel Jones still sucks. Just in case you had any other thought out there, since signing his $160 million deal, he has thrown more pick sixes than he has touchdowns. It's been 1 week, and Malik Neighbors is already frustrated. It's something we talked about all offseason long. There's a lot of talent in that wide receiver room in New York, and Daniel Jones just can't get them the football. So if you're out there with Malik Neighbors in your starting lineup, just be prepared. There could be some up and down weeks with the ceiling that's probably a little bit lower. But all right, let's go ahead and dive in to the waiver wire now. I'm going to be talking about some quarterbacks, running backs, wide receivers, tight ends, and defensive special teams as well. Now, I'm also trying to give some options that are widely available in a lot of leagues. I could go out there and say, you know what? You should replace Jordan Love with Jaden Daniels. Doesn't do you any good if Jaden Daniels is owned in 96% of leagues. Now sure, at times in these videos, I'll list some highly owned players just for you to go look just to make sure. But really my main focus is finding you some guys that should be widely available. So when we go to the quarterback position, we'll start off there because I know some people need to replace Jordan Love. We got Baker Mayfield and Matthew Stafford. Now for Baker Mayfield, played great in week 1. It wasn't the most difficult of matchups. Yes, he went up against Washington, but if you watch him on film, the dude is playing probably the best football of his entire career. He's really starting to live up to those expectations of being a #1 overall pick. He's just doing a lot of things really well. And there's something that has really unlocked Baker Mayfield in Tampa Bay, and that is putting Chris Godwin back into the slot. This is something we talked about all off season long. I hope you drafted Chris Godwin. He was probably one of my most talked about players this entire offseason. When he's in the slot, it's a cheat code for this offense because that opens up more one-on-one coverage on the outside for Mike Evans and rookie Jalen McMillan. Now, everyone knows that the offensive line isn't elite in Tampa Bay. We know that Rachaad White isn't super efficient on the ground. So each and every week, they're going to throw the football in Tampa Bay, and they have plenty of options to catch those balls. Mike Evans, Chris Godwin, Jalen McMillan, Rachaad White is more than enough to give Baker Mayfield a safe floor weekly. Now, he doesn't have the easiest of matchups in week 2. He's going up against Detroit, but Matthew Stafford just hung over 300 yards on them, and there's a lot of youth in this secondary. Plus, it's one of those situations where if Detroit can get a lead, Tampa Bay plays from behind, which means what? Yes, they throw the ball even more. And then we have Matthew Stafford, who I just mentioned. He's only owned in 26% of leagues. Now, he suffered another loss in Detroit, which is not ideal for Matthew Stafford, but we don't care about wins and losses when it comes to fantasy football. The bigger concern is Puka and that injury. How does it affect him? How much time does he miss? Does he miss any time at all? For sure. But now he's got a great matchup going to Arizona. The last time he went to Arizona, he threw for 229 yards and 4 tutties. We saw that Arizona defense in week 1 start off hot against Buffalo and then absolutely melt. It's not a great defense overall in Arizona. They're going to be vulnerable through the air all season long. So Matthew Stafford, like I said, only owned in 26% of leagues, even if he is without Puka Nacua. We got vintage Cooper Kupp out there right now, which gives Matthew Stafford that safer floor in a decent matchup. But I do wish that I could go a little bit deeper at the quarterback position. But as we run through the week 2 schedule, there's just not a lot of great options, right? Gardner Minshew may be out there for you, but he's traveling to Baltimore to face the Ravens. That's not ideal. Bryce Young's going to be available. Don't start Bryce Young in fantasy football. He looked horrible. Derek Carr, maybe, but he's traveling to Dallas to face that Cowboys defense. That's not ideal. What about Malik Willis? He's available. Don't pick up Malik Willis. Then we got maybe Trevor Lawrence. Maybe. A lot of people kind of forgot about him here this year. Didn't play bad in week 1, but he's got a matchup going up against that tough Cleveland Browns defense next week. Then we got Sam Darnold. He's going against the 49ers. Geno Smith traveling to New England. How about Will Levis going up against the Jets? Not ideal. How about even Aaron Rodgers on the other side of that going up against the Tennessee Titans, whose defense is much improved? Are you going to start Daniel Jones? Absolutely not. What about Bo Nix? Not going up against Pittsburgh. That Pittsburgh defense played great in week 1. And that's really probably all. Maybe Caleb Williams is available. He's going up against Houston. I'm not really interested in that. Caleb Williams kind of struggled. Now we know Keenan Allen is banged up as well. Kirk Cousins didn't look good. You can see where I'm going here. There's some options, but not a lot of great options. And that's why Baker Mayfield and Matthew Stafford are the best available here in the vast majority of leagues in week 2. All right, so now let's move on to the running back position. In full disclosure, a lot of these guys are going to be highly owned and may not be available in your fantasy football leagues, but the waiver wire at the running back position is a little thin right now. We're still going to go through a couple of these names. I got Alexander Mattison of the Las Vegas Raiders. He's currently owned, it says, on average in 85% of leagues. That kind of caught me off guard a little bit. There's not very many leagues that I'm in where Alexander Mattison is 85% owned. So that may be somewhat skewed by some of the sites we pull our data from, but if he's available, go out there and take a look. Now, he has a very difficult matchup here in week 2 going up against Baltimore, but he was just second on the team in targets with 6 in the passing game, which is definitely what we're looking for, especially if you play in some sort of PPR scoring. Then we also know that Zamir White lost a fumble in a loss to the Los Angeles Chargers. Madison played 60% of the offensive snaps, and he looked explosive when given an opportunity. If you're looking for some bench depth and he's available, he's somebody that's being used in Las Vegas. Then we have J.K. Dobbins, who shows that he's owned in 90% of leagues. So for the 10% of you out there where he's not, you may want to pick him up. He's got a great matchup going up against the Carolina Panthers. Now, I need to say this. Do I love J.K. Dobbins' rest of season? No, I really do not. But 10 carries for 135 yards and a touchdown cannot be ignored. The part that really bothers me is he couldn't pull away and finish that big run late in the game last week. Now, I know he's had every major injury possible, and I don't expect him to be rookie J.K. Dobbins. But if he's lost a step and he's splitting snaps, we cannot go out there and rely on 10 carries for 135 yards a game. If he's getting right around 10 carries a game, more times than not, he's going to get you right around 50 yards. Now, I don't know about you, but if he doesn't find the end zone, I'm not trying to start guys that are going to score 5 points a week. He's just somebody we need to stash and pay attention to. I've always loved J.K. Dobbins, but after all the injuries he's had, there is concern. How about Tank Bigsby? Says he's owned in 60% of leagues. Another difficult matchup this week going up against Cleveland. But he had the same amount of carries in week 1 that Travis Etienne did, and he was actually a lot more efficient. 12 carries for 73 yards against the Miami Dolphins, and we expect that role to be similar as the season progresses. But here's what I found a little bit interesting. He only played in 32% of the snaps this past week, which means if he was on the field, he was touching the football, which is kind of weird. That's not something you really want to telegraph to your opponents. So one of two things is probably going to happen. His volume is going to decrease or his snaps are going to increase. He's not an absolute must-add by any means, but if you do own Travis Etienne, Tank Bigsby probably needs to be on the bottom of your roster. Then we have Jaleel McLaughlin of the Denver Broncos, currently owned in 7% of leagues, should be out there for a lot of people. A tough matchup for him as well, going up against Pittsburgh in week 2. The reason we had Javonte Williams a little bit lower this offseason is because of Jaleel McLaughlin. They absolutely love this guy in Denver, and he actually out-touched Javonte Williams 15-9, despite playing in 12 less snaps just last week. Now, he didn't really do a whole lot with the volume he got, but if we have a running back out there that's going to get right around 15 touches a week, he deserves to be considered. And then lastly, it's Justice Hill of the Baltimore Ravens, only owned in 1% of leagues, now going up against Las Vegas in week 2. He had 8 targets in week 1, and he's very much so a PPR option for a lot of people because he's really going to be game script dependent. He played in 54% of the snaps last week, and that's really because Baltimore was trailing majority of the game. In closer games or games in which Baltimore has the lead, we're going to see a lot more Derrick Henry than we're going to see Justice Hill. So as a bottom of the bench stash, I don't hate it. Am I picking up Justice Hill to start him anytime soon? No, probably not. But all right, now we get to move on to wide receivers, my favorite position, especially because there's a couple guys on this list that I've talked about all off season long. The first one, Rashid Shaheed of the New Orleans Saints, only owned in 13% 14% of leagues. Now a matchup going up against the Dallas Cowboys this week is not ideal. However, that top defensive attention is going the way of Chris Olave, so Rashid Shaheed could still eat. Now he tied for the team lead in targets with 5 in week 1, and he showed once again that big playability is not a fluke. We talked about this at length this offseason. Is he gonna be some big time volume guy? No, but if he can get 5+ targets a game, he's going to give you a great fantasy season. Does it make him an absolute weekly must start? No, but he needs to be a must-owned wide receiver in fantasy football. Then we got Big Dortch energy. Greg Dortch of the Arizona Cardinals, only owned in 3% of leagues, now a matchup going up against the Los Angeles Rams. He led all ball catchers in week 1 in Arizona with 47 yards receiving, but he also had 8 targets. He was Kyler Murray's safety blanket the entire game in week 1. Now, there was a lot of talk about Greg Dortch this offseason and his involvement in this offense being that he was going to be the starting slot wide receiver. 8 targets in week 1 should open a lot of people's eyes that he needs to be owned in fantasy football. Then we have Khalil Shakir of the Buffalo Bills, only owned in 5% of leagues. Has a matchup this week going up against Miami. Buffalo's going to have to throw the football. Now, obviously, I would have loved to see Khalil Shakir get more targets in week 1. But Buffalo barely even threw the ball for an entire half of football in week 1, so he only ended with 3 catches for 42 yards but had a touchdown. Now, as the season progresses, he's more than likely going to be the safest weekly option in this offense. Dalton Kincaid was absolutely invisible week 1. Khalil Shakir seems to be that quote-unquote safety blanket in the offense. Then we have Trey Tucker of the Las Vegas Raiders, only owned in 1% of leagues, and now a matchup going up against Baltimore. They really want to include this kid more and more in this offense. He has great hands. He's a great route runner. He has game-breaking speed, and he's definitely someone that needs to be kept an eye on when it comes to fantasy football. Because if anything were to happen to Devontae Adams or Jacoby Myers, maybe even Brock Bowers, Trey Tucker's role is only going to increase, and we have a big-time playmaker like that. If he gets more volume, he could turn into a flex play later in the season. And then Xavier Leggett of the Carolina Panthers, only owned in 1% of leagues, now going up against the Chargers this week. He led all players on the team with 7 targets, brought in 4 of them for 35 yards, but this team in Carolina is bad. Even worse than a lot of people thought they were going to be. Some people had higher expectations. Some people thought it was all Deontay Johnson. New head coach Dave Canellis, he's going to right the ship with Bryce Young. That may be one of Bryce's worst games I've ever seen of his entire career. This team is going to be behind a lot, which means they're throwing a lot weekly. Give me the guy that has the opportunity for the most yak yards in this offense, and that's Xavier Leggett. Which means now we can transition to tight ends, the football kind. Of course, we're trying to keep it classy, and it's the one player that so many people talked about on waivers this week. It's Isaiah Likely, tight end of the Baltimore Ravens, owned in 44% of leagues, in a matchup now this week going up against Las Vegas. So many people want Isaiah Likely this week. So many people are going to blow their entire fab budget on Isaiah Likely, and trust me, I get it. 12 targets, 9 catches, 111 yards, and 1 touchdown, which was almost 2 touchdowns against Kansas City there in week 1. But we cannot sit back and expect that weekly. Is he going to have a role in this offense? Abso-freaking-lutely. Is Mark Andrews going to hop on a horse and ride off into the sunset? No, he's probably going to have some decent games throughout the season as well. But if you're desperate for a tight end and he is available, I totally understand trying to grab him. Do I want to blow all my fab budget on Isaiah Likely? Probably not. If you're in a waiver priority league and you have one of the top waiver claims, 1 or 2, and you want to burn it now, I would at least burn it now, right? It's early on in the season. You'll have a chance to regain it as the season progresses, but maybe you lost to Jake Ferguson or a David Njoku and you need somebody right away. Isaiah Likely is not a bad option for sure. I think everyone knows that. Which then brings me to Taysom Hill, the New Orleans Saints. Now, I thought about including all the tight ends in New Orleans. We still got Juwan Johnson and Foster Moreau. But honestly, I stuck with Taysom Hill. He's only owned in 19% of leagues. Now a matchup going up against Dallas, and I just couldn't tell, was it that the tight ends are so involved, or was it that the Carolina defense was just so bad? The reason I stuck with Taysom Hill, he's still getting work on the ground. Had 5 carries in the running game, 2 targets in the passing game. Almost had a huge touchdown play. Had he brought in that touchdown, we're looking at him being the overall tight end 1 or 2 on the week. Now, obviously, he's not going to see a ton of volume, but with the rushing upside, maybe a goal goal line touch here or there. He's still somebody that needs to be considered in fantasy football. Don't tell Kyle I still like Taysom Hill. But then we also have Mike Gesicki of the Cincinnati Bengals. He's only owned in 10% of leagues, and now a matchup going up against Kansas City. The Kansas City team that just allowed all those fantasy points to who? Yes, the name on the top of the list, Isaiah Likely. Now, does T. Higgins return? Does Jamar Chase act like he wants to play football in week 2? Because Mike Gesicki barely missed out on a huge day. He brought in a circus catch type touchdown, however, lost the ball when he hit the ground. If we're going to continue to have some unknowns, though, at the top of the wide receiver depth chart, Mike Gesicki could be a guy that gets more and more looks as the season progresses. And then lastly, Colby Parkinson of the Los Angeles Rams, only owned in 1% of leagues, now a matchup going up against Arizona. This one really has to do with Puka Nacua. If he misses any time, we're going to see an increased role in targets going the way of Colby Parkinson, who already showed in week 1 that he has a decent role in this offense. If we could see him get right around 6, 7, or 8 targets or so in week 2, he could climb into those top 12 tight ends on the week. But then let's go ahead and end it at defensive special teams. If you need to stream a defense here this week, at the top of the list, it's still the Colts. Why is it the Colts? They didn't play great in week 1. They're only owned in 2% of leagues. They're playing Green Bay, and Malik Willis is going to be the quarterback. Enough said. Then we have the LA Chargers. They're only 5% owned in a matchup going up against the Carolina Panthers. Did you see how Bryce Young played in week 1? I'm starting almost all defenses against that offense as of right now. Then the Seattle Seahawks. They're owned in 43% of leagues, but have a matchup going up against New England. Jacoby Brissett got a little bit banged up there, and that passing game is not overly strong in New England by any means. Then we have the Jacksonville Jaguars, 39% owned, going up against Cleveland. To me, I don't know if Deshaun Watson just doesn't care, if he's just, it can't be rust anymore. But there is just something that is off in Deshaun Watson, and it just leads to turnovers, inefficiencies, and a lot lower points. So there you have it. Not a ton available on the waiver wire, but there are some options out there to stash on the bottom of your bench if you need some added depth. Because don't forget, one of the biggest pieces of advice that I can give you, if you want to find success in this game, be sure to be paying attention and being active on the waiver wire. No, that does not mean to go out there and give up on players too early. You don't go out and buy lottery tickets and throw them away before the drawing. But if you have some guys on the bottom of your bench that you're kind of just using as that lottery ticket spot, that's where some of these names can come in. Now, if there's anyone else out there that you're looking at, be sure to leave them down below in the comment section. Because remember, when Headliner Nation works together, that's when we find the most success of any other outlet in fantasy football. Now, I'm going to go ahead and get out of here for the day. Hopefully you enjoy the rest of your day, and then most importantly, do your part to make the world a better place.